Firstly, thank you, Rabbi Kelman, for inviting me to talk about this particular topic. It's one that is very close to my heart, but in ways that one might not expect. So one thing that I want to emphasize at the outset, that this is not a shiur about leining. I think that Bali Kriya will have something of an advantage in appreciating some of the things we're going to talk about, simply for the reason that there's a very big difference, I would say intellectually, when you come to a subject where you have all the data at your fingertips, or a lot of it, and someone is simply trying to place order to the data that you already know in your head, as opposed to where you're approaching something where you've never been exposed to the data before, and now you're being told a series of rules, and then you'll be shown some of the data. So I think Balei Kriya certainly will have a more instinctual appreciation for some of the material that we're doing, but it's really not about leining itself, but it's about, if I had to describe it in one word, one phrase, it's about the impact of Ta'amei HaMikra on interpretation, on biblical interpretation. I'll also state, I don't, of course, scare anybody away, that the opening shiur will probably be the easiest shiur. It'll be the one that's most accessible. The subsequent shiur will be more challenging, I think very much worthwhile. And I would warn the Balei Kriya, unless they have really encountered this material before, it will help being about Koreh, but it will be something that I think is fundamentally new. So let me begin just by talking about the term Ta'amei HaMikra, and I'm normally going to refer to it by I assume it's a Yiddish term, the trop, the symbols that we typically associate with the music. The word tam has at least 3 different meanings. The one that usually comes to mind for most of us is the word ta'am means reason. This is a common usage in Rabbinic Hebrew. It is not one that I think can be associated with the term Ta'amei HaMikra. There are 2 other usages. One, which is very common in the Rishonim, in Ibn Ezra and Radak. And I know, at least from my experience, when I was first learning them, I couldn't understand. They kept using the word tam, but it didn't mean reason. What tam meant was the interpretation. Ibn Ezra will often give you grammatical analysis of a term, of a phrase, and then he'll say v'ta'amo, and its explanation is now what the phrase actually means. And that actually might be one possible way of understanding Ta'amei HaMikra. Ta'amei HaMikra provide an interpretation, a way to interpret any particular verse. And I think it's worth noting that just when we talk about a targum, a translation, either the classic Aramaic targumim or any translation, every translation by definition is interpretation. Now, we tend to think of translations as being very literal, and some translations tend to be very literal, but nonetheless, when you go from translating a text into any language, including its own language, let's say updating a dialect, if you were to translate the Tanakh into modern Hebrew, I've never seen such a thing. I'm sure it must exist. It involves interpretation. There's no such thing as a translation which isn't interpretation. And the translation that the translator presents you with reflects the way he or she has read the text. The same thing can be said about Ta'amei HaMikra, which is whoever is responsible, we'll talk about that a little bit, for our ta'amim, for our trop. It reflects either their own interpretation or their interpretation, the tradition of interpretation that they are now imposing on the text itself. There is a third possible meaning for the word ta'am, I think. I'm not sure I can prove this, but the ta'am can also refer to the accent. Very much in this particular context, the Rishonim will often, and it's hard to tease it out, but we'll look at relatively soon, a couple of Rashis where Rashi will say ta'amo lamala or ta'amo lamata. He'll tell you where the accent is, but since the trop, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is also generally used to tell you where the accent is. So I don't know if you can sort of separate those two, but let me use that as the segue into talking about 3 functions of Ta'amei HaMikra, 3 functions of trop. The first function, which I'm not going to really discuss or explore very much, is to provide music for the text. Why do we have music for a text? So probably the primary reason we do so is based upon a Gemara at the end of Megillah, the last Amud, Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, that kol hakore below ne'ima, v'hashona below zimra, so olav hakasav omer, all these bad things. A person who reads without singing and who studies without a tune. So basically it means that you don't really appreciate what God has given you. Now, that is sort of a homiletic comment. One of the reasons, I think the primary reason, I think we read with a sing song in the Beis Medrash, or where you read the Tanakh with trop, is because it aids in memory. And those who are Bali Kriya know when you're trying to sort of pull a verse out of your head, if you have a piece of it, once you have the beginning, you can sort of naturally flow into the next part. But I think it's really an aid in memory. So I'm not going to talk about the music itself. I mean, there are a few things that I'll lein at some point, but it's really not the focus that we're going to have. The different Eidot, the different communities of Klal Yisrael have different music. The Eastern European musical tradition is one. The Yekas have a different musical tradition. The Sephardim have a different musical tradition. I've never heard Yemenite leining. I assume the Yemenites probably have their own leining, and I'm sure within each of these communities, there are different traditions or different musical ways of implementing the leining. Even within the tradition that I know well, the Eastern European tradition, we have actually 6 different kinds of trop. We have trop for regular Torah reading. We have trop for the Haftarah. We have trop for the Shalosh Regalim Megillos, for Shir HaShirim, for Koheles, and for Rus. We have a trop for Megillas Esther. We have a similar but slightly different trop from Esther for Megillas Eicha. And we have the trop that is typically used on Yom Norah, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Some people use it for shtick purposes on Simchas Torah. So we really have a whole different set of musical I don't know what you want to call it. I won't call it traditions, even within the Eastern European tradition. And that's not counting something that I'll talk about in a few weeks, God willing, which is a trop for the 3 books we call the Sifrei Emes, Eov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, which actually have different trop than the other 21 books of Tanakh. And as the other 21 books of Tanakh have the same trop with the same rules of how they're used, but we lein some of them in different ways. But the 3 books, Eov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, which are primarily poetry in their construction, have a different set of trop. At first glance, they might look a little familiar, but most of them, or many of them, are very, very different in how they're used. So I'm not really going to explore the musical tradition, but that's obviously the one. If you step into a shul and you hear the Torah read, the thing that's going to jump out at you and you're going to assume is going to be based upon the trop is going to be the music of the person reading the Torah. The second, which I'm going to talk about just a little bit now, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, is the issue of pronunciation, specifically where the accent on a word goes. I don't know. I'm sure there's some people in the audience who share this particular feeling, but to me, there's nothing that's more painful than to hear the Torah read with the wrong accents. When sometimes when they call someone for Haftarah and they perform an act of ritual slaughtering on it. So my friends love, I usually sit, I think pretty much the front row, they can see, they want to see the pained expression on my face, because even if I try to suppress it, I tell my students that, I could be dead lying in the coffin. And if at my hesped, you mispronounce the accent on the pasuk you quote, I'll probably open the lid and correct you. So trop plays a role in telling you where the accent goes. And this is crucial in many cases. I won't say most cases, but in many cases, the shifting an accent on a word can change the meaning. I'm not going to explore this. I'm going to give a couple of examples. And even before I give them out, I'll give you one. I would say in general, this topic is somewhat relevant for davening as well. We don't have ta'amim on davening. But we would do well actually to have ta'amim for 2 of the 3 functions that ta'amim play, HaMikra play for scripture. We could use them in davening as well. The accents for words, and the other, which is the last part, which is really our focus, is punctuation. The commas, the sentence divisions, and bigger units, smaller units, and so on. So that's really going to be our main focus. But just for a few minutes about accents. One in particular, davening, which really is a significant one. It's significant because it turns what is a statement about God's greatness into a statement of blasphemy. In the bracha of Modim, of Hoda'ah, so we say Hatov kilo chalu rachamecha v'hamarachem kilo samu chasadecha. The expression Hatov kilo chalu rachamecha means that God is good and his mercy never ceases. The root of kalu is kaf lamed yud, and words like that almost always have the accent on the last syllable. So the word is kalu, not kalu. And that phrase is actually based upon a pasuk in Eicha, where Yirmiyahu Navi says, ki lo chalu rachamav, describing God, his mercy never ceases. If you read the word chalu with the accent, what we call mila'el, there are two kinds of Hebrew accents. I should say there are only two places on a Hebrew word in Tanakh where an accent can be. The last syllable, which is called milara. Milara means in Aramaic below, mitachas, or mila'el, which means above, the second to last syllable. There is no accent in Hebrew on any syllable but the last or the second to last syllable. And if you think you see such a thing, they're rare examples, you're not seeing correctly. So if you read the word chalu, it's a completely different word. It comes from the root chaf vav lamed, which means God's mercy is insufficient. It can't contain what is needed. In which case, you're basically saying God's mercy, God doesn't have enough mercy. He's not capable. That's basically blasphemy. So one of the reasons why people mispronounce it is because the next word, tov kilo chalurah kilo samu chasadecha, that accent attracts the first accent to read it as kilo chalu. But you should be very careful when you daven for the amid and privately that you say hatov kilo chalu rachamecha. So there are probably other examples in davening, but that's the one that always sort of comes to mind as the classic example where if you miss the accent, you've not just mispronounced the word, but you've done some very bad things. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about a few examples about accents in a moment, but I just want to, again, not lose focus. The third function of trop is to provide punctuation in the sentence. And that is obviously, even more so than accent, that's absolutely crucial for meaning, because shifting a comma can have huge implications. I suspect there's a book called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, which it perfectly encapsulates that idea that where you put the commas will completely change the meaning of the sentence. So that's really what we're going to focus on. But just a couple of examples of accents. Now, if you take a look at the source sheet, and the first one is very, very famous. I think if there's one example of a shift in accent that changes the meaning, and both have valid meanings, it's a Rashi in Parshas Vayetze. This is not the only place where Rashi talks about this kind of a word, but I've chosen this as the example. So Yaakov comes to Haran, and he meets the shepherds, and he asks them if they know Lavan ben Nachar, and they say Yadanu. And then he asks them, and this is the first pasuk Vav, Vayomer lohem hashalom lo. Is he well? Vayomru shalom. Yeah, he's in peace. V'hinei Rachel bito ba'a im hatzon. So the trop on the word ba'a, which is the only trop I placed here, is under the aleph. Now Rashi notes that when the root beis vav aleph means to come, but if you say about a woman ba'a, it means she is coming. It's present tense. If you say ba'a mila'el on the first syllable, on the second to last syllable, it means she came or has come. It's already past tense. Now, later, a few psukim later, when Rachel finally shows up, it says, Odenu midaber imam, v'Rachel ba'a, the trop there is on the base, im hatzon asher le'avia kira'ahi. So at that point, she had come. The shepherds told Yaakov, she's coming. And then the narration, the Torah narrates to us at that point, she had come already. Rashi writes, source number 2, ba'a im hatzon, hata'am ba'alef, either the accent or the trop, which in this case will be in effect the same, is on the aleph. V'targumo in the Aramaic translation is osiyah, which is the present tense in Aramaic. V'rachel ba'a hata'am lamala, the accent is mila'el, it's on the second to last syllable. Bebeis, v'targumo asas, which means she came. Harishon lishon osa, the first one is present tense, she is doing, she is coming. V'hasheni lishon osisa. So this happens to be characteristic of pretty much all what we call ayin vav verbs, the other very common one. and there are some confusing problems in Parshas Vayigash about this, is the word shava. Shava means she returned. Shava means she is returning. So that's one example. The second example, which is a favorite example of mine, is special for two reasons. Number one is that both meanings are actually plausible, or certainly seem to be plausible. Number two, it's particularly interesting for me because I don't know what it is or what it reflects about my personality, but I can remember almost every mistake I've made in Kriyas Torah. It's not because I've only made 3 mistakes over the course of the years, or I should say things that I learned wrong in the first place and only learned later. I have a lot of memories of those things, and they're not a few. They're not a few. They're a good number of them. And this happens to be one that the first 2 years I was reading Kriyas Torah, as a teenager, nobody corrected me. And I only realized later, and I realized the difference in meaning. So speaking about, in Parshas Vayishlach, about the brothers plundering Shechem after Shimon and Levi killed everybody, it says, Ves kol chelam, ves kol tapam, ves neshehem, all their money and their children and their wives, shavu vayavozu. Now, what does the word shavu mean? So if you're not initiated so much, you would think it means, they made multiple trips. They came back and they plundered. They had taken some stuff. They took first they took Dinah out, and now the brothers, they come back and they take out the rest of the stuff. The Eis Kol HaShavavais, everything in their houses. But that's not what the word shavu means. The word shavu, with the accent where it is, means to take captive. Shin beis yud. It's very much connected to the word biza, vayavozu. Those two words are connected. So it means that their plunder, maybe it's their animals and their children and their wives, they took captive and they plundered and everything that was in the house. Now, Rashi writes here, lishon shavu, lishon shiviyah. Lefikach Tamo milara. I don't know if that's really originally part of Rashi, but Rashi tells you that the accent is on the last syllable. That teaches you that it's shin beis yud, like chalu is kaf lamed yud. If the accent had been milael on the shin, so then it would have been shavu vayavozu, they returned and they took captive, which is not impossible. It could have made sense in the pasuk, but that's not the more likely reading, and that's not where the Balei Masora placed it's not, I didn't explain with Balei Masora, more on that in a little bit. That's where the accent, the trop, was placed to tell you how to read the word. Now, a word of caution, if you're an uninitiated as a Bal Kriya, and you're using the trop to figure out how you pronounce the word, it is generally speaking a good rule that wherever the trop is where the accent is, except there are a number of exceptions. One of them, for example, if you turn to the last sheet, and here once again I will speak of my personal, this is truly mortifying. I was taught for my bar mitzvah, but I'm not going to say who taught me, because there's certain things that he didn't teach me. And one of them was, he didn't teach me that if you look at the fifth trop, kadma munach zarka munach segol, it's true for the zarka and the segol that the trop is always placed right after the last letter. It doesn't tell you where the accent is. So I know my bar mitzvah parsha, in Parshas Truma, the first year, and then the second year, I leined the next year, and then a friend's father came over and gently pointed this out to me. I read that shlosha givim meshukadim b'kanei achad kaftar v'ferach, ushlosha givim meshukadim b'kanei achad kaftar v'ferach. Now, that accent would almost kill me now to think that I would have read something that way, but I hadn't been told that the zarka, and if you're looking at the trop now, the segol, further on the line, the pashta, and then the plisha kitana, plisha gedola on the next line, and there is, what do I think, is there one more? I don't remember. Is there one more? Maybe that's it for now. Those, oh yes, the yesiv on the last line there that I've added in. Those trop are not placed where the accent is. Most of them, 4 of them, are always placed after the last letter. The Tlisha Gedolah and the Yesiv are normally placed before the first letter of a word. Now you'll ask me, how do you know where the accent goes in those cases? The answer is you have to know the Hebrew language. Most of the time, knowing the Hebrew language, The better way, that's not fair. What I should say is if you can find that word elsewhere in Tanakh with a regular trop, not one of these 6 trop, you'll find out where the accent actually goes. If you cannot find it in another place, so ask your local Baal Kriya, who's if he's pretty good, he'll probably know the answer to the question. Only one of those trop, by the way. Well, I won't talk about that more now. I'm going to leave that for now. More about that when we talk about next week, when we go through the trop one by one. I'll point out some of the individual details. But I will spill you one very juicy tidbit, which is, does anybody know why the Tlisha and the Gedola and the Tlisha Katana are placed the way they are? Why is the Tlisha Gedola placed after the word and Tlisha Katana before the word? I won't ask. The answer is, if you go back to the, what's that?
It's the other way around.
I'm sorry, Tlisha Gedola before the word, Tlisha Katana after the word. Why are they placed in that way? And the answer is because in the earliest versions of the trop, when they were this written symbols, the symbol for the Tlisha Gedola, Tlisha Katana were identical. They were just a circle with no leg. And the only way the Bali Masora, whom I will explain in a moment who they are, could distinguish between the two was to put one before the word and one after the word. Okay. So anyway, so trop plays a crucial role in terms of determining where you place the accent, and not always, but a lot of the time that can have an impact upon meaning. Okay. So now I want to really turn to the primary function before, which is punctuation. Before we do that, I want to give you just a brief history as to the trop. Where does it come from? Now, the Gemara in source number 5, speaking about a pasuk in Ezra Nehemiah, where they had a public Torah reading. So the Gemara says, you can already go to the second line, Vayikru b'sefer Toras ha'elokim. And this, by the way, there is no such pasuk. It's actually Vayikru b'sefer b'toras ha'elokim. Don't ask why this happened in every printing of the Gemara. HaMikra. That's actually reading the pasuk. Miforash is the next word. Zetargum. That's the explanation. Visom sechel, which means to pay attention, to put one's mind to it. Elu hapsukim. They are the verse breaks. And vayavinu b'mikra, they understood, or they penetrated, had a penetrating understanding of scripture. Ze pisuk ta'amim. This is what we would call the trop, but a very specific notion, pisuk, which refers to punctuation. V'amri la elu hamasoros. I'm not going to talk about what the masoros are right now, what the alternative version is. But what does this mean, elu hapsukim? So if you look in source 6, the Ran says, nikudos hamafsikos bein pasuk lepasuk. Now, it's very, very interesting that if you look at the earliest Tanakhs, you will see that there are actually 2 markers to an end of a pasuk. The one of them is actually a trop. Many of you who know this call it a self-pasuk. The term that's actually used is a siluk. The siluk is the little dash, the little line, vertical line underneath the last word in the pasuk. There are also, and I'm pretty sure you will see this in the early Tanakhs, a colon between verses. That colon is not trop. It's just a verse division. It plays a role, but it's not technically necessary. So the Ran sounds like when he says elu hapsukim, it's the 2 dots that separate verses, what we would call a colon. But in the early Tanakhs, it's used actually as the verse separator. And then you have these pisuk ta'amim. So what exactly is the pisuk ta'amim? So the Ran then continues and says, he says something here, but this is really more relevant for the trop. He says, "V'kari lahu som sechel," which is the it calls this understanding or paying attention. Shal yedeim adam mevin haMikra kefi tnuas ha'ta'amim. Based upon these, a person can understand the flow of the trop, the motion of the trop. Ki da'amar beperakama dechagiga nafkel mina lipsuke tame. Now that really, and we're going to look at the Gemara Chagiga and spend a little time on this because it's a fascinating example. The Gemara Chagiga says, the Gemara Chagiga has a question of biblical interpretation. What does a verse mean? And the Gemara says, okay, well, what's the difference? Because it's about something that happened at Maimed Har Sinai, about karbanos, the sacrifices that were brought. What was. It's not happening anymore. Who cares? So the Gemara there says, nafkamina lepsuke taime. No, the relevance is when you read scripture, what kind of trop do you put on there? What kind of punctuation or commas do you place? So now let's take a look at that Gemara in Chagiga. Now, first, let's just read the verse. It's on the bottom of the first source sheet. It says, "Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael." This is at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, probably before Matan Torah. "Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael vayalu olos, vayizbechu zvachim shlamim lashem parim." Now, if I were just translating this verse, I would say, and Moses sent the young people, let's say the firstborns of the Jewish people, and they brought olah sacrifices. And they slaughtered shlamim sacrifices to God, oxen. Now, the Gemara wants to know the following. Take a look at source 7 now. Bo'i Rav Chisda. Haikra heichiksiv. How is one to understand this pasuk? Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael vayalu olos. That would be kavasim. That might be the standard olah. They brought sheep. And then vayizbechu zvachim shlamim lashem parim. So would you understand that there are really two sentences here? First, vayalu olos, they brought olos. It doesn't say what they brought, but probably they could have been sheep. And then they brought shlamim sacrifices, and they brought oxen for them. So that's one way of reading it. Odilma idi v'idim parim havu. Do you say that the word oxen at the end of the verse modifies both parts? Vayalu olos, number 1, and vayizbechu zvachim shlamim lashem parim. The olos were oxen, and the shlamim were oxen. And the Gemara says, "Lamai nafkamina." What difference does it make? Marzutra amar lepisuk ta'amim. How you want to place the trop. Now, I'm going to look at. I presented the pasuk here in two different ways. The first way is the way the trop actually read. The second way is the alternative interpretation. And Rabbi Breuer actually, I should stop for one moment just to give a lot of credit. Most of what I know about Tamei HaMikra's punctuation, it's a beyond the very basics. Beyond the very basics comes from Rav Mordechai Breuer, who was obviously a giant in Tanakh study, and he has a sefer called Tamei HaMikra. This is not a work, I would say, for the faint-hearted. It is a challenging book to read. If you're a Baal Kriya, it's much easier, although it is still quite challenging. But so much of what I've learned about the finer details of punctuation really come from Rabbi Breuer. So in this particular case, he has a piece in his last chapter about interpretation where he goes through more than one possibility. But I'm just presenting here, I think, the two most straightforward possibilities in the Gemara. One, the first is what we have in our trop, and the second is what the alternative would have been. So if you look at the first presentation, and this is the way it works, and I'll read it with the music. So here we can have musical accompaniment, because the music doesn't always, but very often does convey to some extent the sense of punctuation. So it goes like this: Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael vaya'alu olos. Now that's the esnachta, and many of you are aware that's the major pause dividing a pasuk into two. And then vayizbechu zivachim shlamim ladonai parim. Now, if you read it that way, and that is the first way the Gemara presents it, it's Moshe sent the Bechorim, and they brought olos. Now, it doesn't say what animals they used, but that is the major pause. And the second half of the sentence says, "Vayizbechu zvachim shlamim laHashem parim." In the second half of the verse, the biggest pause, and this is what we're going to work on next week, is after the word laHashem. It means they brought shlamim sacrifices to God, comma parim. There's a smaller pause after the word shlamim. But if you read it this way, which is the way our Sifrei Tanakh read, it's the first interpretation offered in the Gemara, which is that the olos were not necessarily oxen. There's a second way, and this is not the only way that one could have placed the trop, although if you believe the word parim, modifies both olos, both the ola sacrifices and the shlama sacrifices, this is probably the best way. Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael, vayalu olos, vayizbechu zevachim shlamim, ladonai parim. Now, when you break it down this way, when I look at the second half of the verse, the first biggest division in the verse is after the word la Hashem. So the two halves of the second part of the verse are Vayalu olos vayizbechu zvachim shlamim l'Hashem, parim. So it's clear parim modifies both. The next step is going to be the following. Within the previous clause, the biggest pause is after the word shlamim. So it's Vayalu olos vayizbechu zvachim shlamim l'Hashem. L'Hashem goes on both of them. Both of them were sacrifices for God, and then they were parim. And then within the first 5 words, Vayalu olos vayizbechu zvachim shlamim, there was one pause on the word olos. When I say those pauses, in this case, it's not just the meaning. Here, the trop conforms to the meaning. Now, I should not forget to mention, trop doesn't always conform to meaning. Most of the time it does. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But anyway, so what we have here then is a verse with 2 different kinds of trop, which conveys 2 very different meanings. And that was the question that the Gemara had. Now, the Gemara speaks about there being trop, although there were 2 opinions, whether there were trop in the time of Ezra. I know with absolute certainty 2 things. I know that there was trop by the time of the Gemara, and I also know, though, that the trop itself was not rigid and fixed as much, perhaps, as the way we have it now. I know that because there's a Gemara in Yoma, this is source number 9, that says, Isi ben Yehuda Omer, HaMikra os baTorah, ein lohem hechreya. There are 5 words in the Torah where it's not clear where the punctuation goes. And they quote the 5 words. I will tell you that 4 of them, the pshat, I think, is clear. But I only want to mention one because it genuinely could be seen as ambiguous. And that is the word mishukadim. It refers to a pasuk in my Bar Mitzvah Parsha. Uva menorah arba'a givim mishukadim kaftorah frachaha. There were 3 kinds of decorations in the menorah in the Mishkan. There were gviim, they translate them as goblets. There was the shape or something like that. There were kaftorim and prachim. Prachim are flowers. Kaftorim, maybe, I don't know, were some kinds of round balls or something like that. So the verse reads, Uva menorah arba'a gviim mishukadim kaftorah frachaha. There are 2 ways to read that verse. Uva menorah arba'a gviim, comma, and mishukadim kaftorah frachaha. The kaftorim and the prachim were mishukadim. They were decorated with almonds or something. The other way to read it is Uvam Nora Arba'a Givim Meshukadim, comma, Kaftarah Fracheha, maybe we're also Meshukadim. That's what the Gemara is not sure about. Now, here's the interesting question. I know what the trop on that pasuk is. I'll read it for you. Uvam Nora Arba'a Givim Meshukadim, Kaftarah Ufracheha. It's clear where the Asnachta is. So the question I ask is, why didn't Isi ben Yehuda just look at where the Asnachta is? So that at least implies to me that there's some degree of things are not quite rigid. Today, you wouldn't ask the question. You'd look in your Tanakh, and the earliest Tanakhs that we have, with trop, and it's very clear where they go. Okay. So anyway, so that is as far as the earlier stages. Where do our trop come from? So there, I've referred to once by accident and once on purpose, the people known as the Balei Masora. In a nutshell, this is not the place for it. Until the 5th century, 6th century, our Sifrei Tanakh basically looked like a Sefer Torah. All they had in them were letters and spaces, sometimes bigger spaces for Parshias, and that's it. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see Torah scrolls or Tanakh scrolls that would have looked the same even 6 centuries later. Came along these people called the Balei Masora. I'm oversimplifying. For our purposes, the Balei Masora we know lived in Tiberias, and they did their work probably between the 6th and the 10th centuries. They were the ones who took our consonantal text. They created a vowel system, a written vowel system, so you would know how to pronounce the words. They didn't invent the pronunciation. They had a received tradition of how the words were pronounced, but they invented the symbols for our vowels. They invented the symbols for music, our trop, and they laid it down for us. And they did some other very important things to make sure that the text was preserved very carefully in its transmission to prevent errors from happening. So the Balei Masorah were the ones who basically gave us our trop and on the words, and for the most part at this point our trop is relatively uniform across different printings and different texts. But obviously when the Balei Masorah presented it, so it represented their interpretation of the text. I don't mean necessarily their own, but their received interpretation of the text. And so I'm going to look at a couple of them. But what I do want to say before I go there is that punctuation, the trop provides punctuation, but it's not always accurate. The reason for that is because sometimes the way verses are constructed, it doesn't lend itself readily to the system of trop that we have. The system of trop that we have on Torah specializes in breaking things down into two. We'll see eventually the Ta'amei Emes do a little better breaking things down into three when necessary, but Torah trop can be fairly constrained because it only naturally breaks units down into two, and then further units, subunits into two. That's its most natural breakup. So between that and the fact that word order can sometimes be funny, it doesn't always work so easily. So we're going to look at some examples over the course of the coming weeks to explore when it doesn't really fit. And again, that's before you get to interpretation, before you get to midrashim that might be incorporated and things like that. The system of trop isn't perfect for sometimes for capturing the meaning in punctuation. But so that is a limitation. There also may be musical reasons for certain things, why certain decisions are made. They don't always conform perfectly to punctuation. But with that caveat, for the most part, the trop provides a pretty good guide to punctuation. And that's mostly what we're going to be looking at. One notable example where you can see funny things go on with the trop is the Tam HaElyon and the Tam HaTachton in the Ten Commandments, in the Aseret HaDibros. There are two sets of trop there. In many printings, they print them at the same time. Woe to the inexperienced Balkore who's got to figure out what's going on there. Which trop? Because the word has two drops on it. But those are very unusual verses. Some very unusual things happen because there's a different agenda there. The agenda there is to have each commandment be one verse, which means Shabbos and Anochi are enormous. They're giant, or Oloia are enormous because those are very long commandments. On the other hand, you have very short commandments like Lo Tirtzach and Lo Tinaf and so on and so forth. But on the whole, the punctuation generally conforms. So the trop conforms to the punctuation. So I wanted to take really, I guess we have time for two, maybe, I don't know if I'll have time for a third example of very, very famous examples of this, where trop can be used for meaning. And in some case, it reflects very specific traditions that we have. My favorite one, and I think it's a famous one, is a verse that we read every year in Chutzla, or it's twice in Israel once. Say ulamad ma bikesh lavan arami lasos sheparo lo gazar al azcharim v'lavan arami bikesh lakor es hakol. Now, and then we say shenemar, and we quote the pasuk of Arami Oved Avi. Now, Arami Oved Avi is a very well. So how does the Baal HaHaggadah understand it? And this is reflected in the Medrash Halacha, source number 11, the Medrash Tanaim Ledvarim, and it's reflected in Targum Onkelos and then in Rashi, but Rashi is obviously later. These are two, the Medrash Tanaim and Onkelos, I don't know if they're earlier than the Baal HaGadah, but they're very early. They all reflect the idea that Arami refers to Lavan Arami, and Oved means that he tried to destroy Avi, my father Yaakov. So the way the Targum translates source number 12, Lavan Arama'ah, Be'ah wanted to, La'abada Yos Abba. He wanted to destroy my father. And that's how the Baal HaGadah read it, that's how Rashi reads it. There's one significant problem with this interpretation. The problem is that the word Oved in biblical Hebrew, in the binyan, the conjugation in which it's in, is what we call intransitive, what the Rishonim call Poel Eno Yotze. It doesn't take a direct object. If you wanted to say that Lavan tried to destroy my father, you should have said Lavan Ibed es Abba in the PL, or Evid es Abba in the Hifil. Oved is intransitive. It doesn't act on something else. And as Ibn Ezra and Rashbam point out, Oved means lost or wandering or straying. Ibn Ezra claims poor. We say a se oved, a wandering sheep, a lost sheep. So the problem is, so what do you do with that? So I'm not here to answer that question. However, what is the pshat in the pasuk? What's the simple meaning? The simple meaning, Ibn Ezra and Rashbam both say, although each one identifies a different figure. Rashbam says, I think Arami was Avram Avinu, and Arami Oved, Avi. A wandering Aramean was my father. And Ibn Ezra says it was Yaakov. Okay, either way, it means the same. It means he was impoverished. He was lost. Now, the difference between these two interpretations is in each shoots and leaves problem, which is where do you put the comma? The way the Baal HaHaggadah read it is Arami Oved Avi, Arami comma, and Aramean Oved Avi tried to destroy my father, subject and predicate. But if you want to read like Ibn Ezra and Rashbam, so then you read Arami Oved Avi. My father is the subject, and Arami Oved is the predicate. My father was a wandering Aramean. Now, what does the trop reflect? So there were two options here. The correct trop, I mean the way the Bali Masora placed it for us, is in the pasuk itself. Arami Oved Avi, because the trop on Arami is a pause trop, and Oved Avi are connected with their trop. If that reflects the way we read Kriyas HaTorah, and if someone misread it, I would correct them because the authorized interpretation is that of the Bali Masora. The alternative would be to read what I placed just below that, Arami Oved Avi. You would put the pashta on the Oved. So here, with a very simple trop, which lousy Balei Kriya very often mess this kind of thing up when they had not well prepared, but by shifting the position of that pashta trop, the one that's on Arami in the pasuk, and in my version on Oved, that simply shifts where the comma is, and that reflects two very different interpretations of scripture. One more, I'll just do one more example, and then I'll allow time for questions. Is an interesting situation of what was the birth order of Noah's 3 children. Now we know at the end of Parshas Bereishis, source number 17, the Torah tells us, Vayihi Noach ben chamesh me'o shana. Noach was 500 years old. Vayolad Noach es Shem es Ham es Yafes. Now normally, when I introduce, my children, and I say this is Avram and this is Yitzchak and this is Yaakov, you assume Avram's the oldest, Yitzchak is the middle child, and Yaakov is the youngest child. That's what we normally would assume. So we're tempted to assume that Shem is the oldest, Ham is the middle child, and boy did he have middle child syndrome, and Yefes would be the youngest. However, that's not so simple, because after Ham does what he does, the Torah tells us the following in source 18, the second verse. Vayiketz Noach miyeno. Noach woke up from his drunken stupor. Vayeda Isa sharasalo b'Noach katan. And he realized what his youngest son had done to him. Now his youngest, the son who had done whatever he did, was Ham. Now, to make things a little more interesting, Eila told those Shem, source 19. These are the genealogies of Shem. Shem ben Ma'ashana. Shem was 100 years old, Vayolad es HaParshad, when he gave birth to HaParshad, Shnasayim achar HaMabul. That means that Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the Mabul. How old was Noach 2 years after the Mabul? 602. But Noach gave birth to his first child at 500. So Shem could not have been his oldest child. There was at least one son born before Shem. And then the last piece to the puzzle is a verse earlier in Parshas Noach, source number 20. U'l'shem yulad gamhu, avi kol b'nei Ever, achi Yefes hagadol. Shem was the Shem is the last of the children to have his genealogies listed. So you have Ham, then you have Yefes, and you have Yefes, then you have Ham, and then you have Shem. And the Torah says that Shem also had children. Shem was the father of all b'nei Ever, achi Yefes hagadol, the brother of Yefes, the elder. So there's an ambiguity here, as Rashi points out immediately. Eini Yodan, source 21, im Yefes hagadol, im Shem. I don't know who's older, Yefes or Shem. And what Rashi basically reasons is, if Ham is the youngest, and Shem or Yefes has to be the oldest, based upon when Shem was born, when Noach was 502, it must be that Yefes is the older. But what Rashi is asking here fundamentally is a comma question. If you want to say that Shem is Achi Yefes Hagadol, is it Shem is Achi Yefes Kama Hagadol, meaning he is the older brother of Yefes, or is Shem Achi the brother of Kama, Yefes Hagadol, the oldest one? What's particularly interesting to me here is that Rashi did not appeal to the trop to solve his problem. It happens to be that the trop is the same as Rashi's interpretation, because the way it's read is Achi Yefes Hagadol. It's Tipcha, which is a major pause, followed by Yefes Hagadol, which go together. If in fact Shem were the older one, then the pasuk would have read the way that one of the most common mistake amongst Balei Kriya who aren't careful, it would have read Achi Yefes Hagadol. It's probably the most common error of Balei Kriya is to reverse Amercha Tipcha, and it's a big no-no. But here, it literally changes the interpretation 180 degrees. Who is the oldest sibling? And yet Rashi didn't appeal to the trop, but it happens to be that the trop reflects a particular interpretation. There are many, 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 many examples of this. I gave one more. I'm not going to go through it now, but you can watch. If you look in source 24, Rashbam attacks a certain interpretation and says that anybody who interprets that way does nothing about how psukim are breaking up and how trop work. Incidentally, he was talking about his grandfather Rashi. I could defend Rashi, but anyway, you can read that on your own. But this really is sort of, in a broad nutshell, in a broad overview, really is the function of trop. This last part, which is to provide the punctuation. So what we've seen tonight really is that trop has three functions. It has a musical function, which we're not going to discuss at all. It has a function of telling you, in most cases, where the accent is, which can have an impact upon meaning, and that we discussed a little bit. And then the third most significant part of Ta'amei HaMikra, of the trop, is to provide commas of various levels so one knows how to parse the verse, and therefore one understands actually what the verse may mean. So in many cases, it doesn't always impact the meaning, because sometimes there's only one possible meaning, but there are a lot of cases where changing the trop, or where how the trop got placed, can actually choose between two different meanings. In effect, Ta'amei HaMikra are an interpretation. Okay, I'll stop the formal presentation here. I'm happy to take questions for a few minutes.
Thank you. You want to take a look on the side?
I can do. Let me. Okay.
Or I can feed you the couple comments.
I just want to know: are all these questions or just comments to other people?
Both. You have to go through them. Well, I can do that for you a little bit.
Okay.
May I ask a question when you're doing that?
Go ahead.
Vayishlach Avraham es yado vayikach et macheles lishchot es beno. The Torah actually learns halacha from this. It's not a misplaced asnachta. There was a pause. Where would you put the asnachta otherwise? I disagree quite, Rav, with your premise. The trop always informs the meaning and the punctuation.
I think that we will see examples where there is no way to tell me that the trop is informing the meaning. I'm not. There are many, many wonderful examples. One could argue that Vayishlach Avram es yado, and that the pshat should have been Vayishlach es kama esachta, Vayikach es malchos l'shchot es beno. And you can, or I could think of, I don't know what the Torah says, I could think of interpretation.
Parshas Tzav, Zos Toras Ha'ola. We'll discuss it next time if you're interested. These are the 12 sides, that the sakin must be nifdak.
Okay, all I would say is that. Okay. All I would say is that without forgetting about the halacha,
doesn't mention the trop.
For dramatic purposes, I could see why that would be done. I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Okay. Somebody wants to know, are the klishas meant to be sung differently? You put them, they have to do. And why in the world would they have it just as a circle? Why didn't they create it differently?
So this is what's very interesting about this. The tlishas, the way I was taught them, they're very similar, but I can distinguish them, which is tlisha ketano, tlisha gedola. Now, what's strange about the music being similar is that the tlisha gedola is a pause trop. It's what we call a mafsik. A tlisha ketana is what's called a mishares. It serves the next word. Now I have heard, and I heard this once from a kid laying bar mitzvah in my shul, and I think it comes from some conservative cantor, a tradition of reading a Tlisha Gedola much closer to a pazer. The way he read it was Tlisha Gedola. Now I'll tell you why it's right, and I'll tell you why it's wrong. It always made sense to me because it's a pause trop, like a pazer. Not only that, but it happens to be a Tlisha Gedola is a substitute for a pazer. When you can't use a pazer based upon number of words, a Tlisha Gedola is the substitution. In that way, it makes sense. But at the same time, Breuer points out, the fact that they use the same symbol for both suggests that the music was probably very similar, which would be a defense of the tradition that I learned to read the two. So you can make an argument both ways, whether the music should be similar or not. There are two different traditions, if you might want to put it, two different ways it's done. And you could go either way on it. But the most important thing that I think is clear is that a Tlisha Gedola, no, but not disputed. Tlisha Gedola is a pause trop. A Tlisha Ketana is attached to the next word.
Why?
For my knowing the difference between Tlisha Ketana and Tlisha Gedola, to me, it seemed that the Tlisha Ketana was longer because it went down at the end, whereas the Tlisha Gedola seemed to stay there. So I said, this doesn't make sense.
So I know, but I think you could sort of see a little bit. Again, the way this young man did it, was taught to do it, really stood out. It stood out. He happened to be bar mitzvah parsha was Pinchas. So you have at the end Minchas and you had a series every day was like that. So like if you missed the first one, by the next 6 you realize like what's going on here. But I think even I'm not sure, the difference isn't obvious enough to explain one is a pause or not. If you know that one is a pause and one is not, then you can sort of tell yourself, one really leads into the next one not. But I'm not sure. Okay.
Why couldn't you put a pazer where you put a Tlisha? You said the Tlisha is.
Pazer requires a certain. I hopefully over the next couple of weeks we'll talk about it. But pazer requires a certain number of words. Theoretically, you can have two pazers in a row, but if you don't have enough words, one of them gets changed to a Tlisha Gedola.
Okay.
Substitute trop.
Somebody's asking. I have to think what this is in Parshat Vayigash. I also have haba'a twice. Mil-el, mil-el, and mil-ra.
I don't want to go into that. The problem there is that the meaning actually doesn't conform to the way the trop is done. That's a discussion for biblical Hebrew, not a discussion for us. So different class, a different course. But I'm aware some of those don't actually. There are issues with some of those. I'm just going to leave it at that. Let's put it this way: for those whoever asked the question, there's a very big problem if the word is ba'a, putting a hey on it. A verb normally never has a hey in front of it. Only a noun or an adjective, which is what a hoveh is. And a past tense verb should not be able to get a hey in front of it. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I won't say anything more on it. That's a very complicated case.
Okay, I hope I understand this question of Baruch. The meaning of le'el, like milel before, technically means above. Higher is le'ela mikol berchata in Kaddish. But since earlier on the written and printed page is situated higher on the page, it is used to mean earlier too. Is that correct?
I don't. That sounds plausible to me. I don't know what the origin. Why earlier in the word is higher and the other one is lower. I don't know. I just know that that's what those words mean in Aramaic. So.
Okay, let's just see. Parshat Chukat, it is short, but it's the same trop issue as the Ten Commandments. I'm not sure what that's talking about in Parshat Chukat. No, I don't know what you're referring to.
I'm over here. There's a different shirim in the Torah. One of them is the Aseret HaDibrot, one of them Shirat Hayam, one of them is in Chukat, and sometimes the trop switched. I don't remember where exactly, but I remember that my teacher told me there was a thing. I don't remember exactly where. I'll find it for you for next time.
Okay.
Yisrael et Ashirazos Ali be'er enula. That's what you're referring to.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm not
my
sure.
Own bar mitzvah parsha. I should have known.
I know there's Shiras HaBe'er in Chukas. I don't know what the question is.
Yeah, what's the question?
Wasn't there a trop differentiation where the symbols didn't match?
I'm not sure.
So why didn't my Rav tell me that?
I'm still not sure. I don't know. I'm wondering if something got lost in translation.
Would he be
I-
referring to the minhag of Az Yashir of singing it a little differently in terms of the tune?
I think so.
I mean, I think the answer, the question why we don't sing it differently. So we don't. It happens to be the Shiras Hayam is the only one of the shiros that we sing differently. Some people, I do at least the travels in Maseh a little differently. Some people do them Haloska differently, but it's the only shira. I don't know. I mean, I know what the pattern is. It's usually when God's name appears, is when we do the special tune. Actually, now that you're saying that, I believe actually that's probably why. That's probably taught you. There's no. I think Rashi quotes God's name doesn't appear. I think in the Shiras HaBe'er because Moshe's name doesn't appear, something like that. Because Moshe was smitten by the bear, so that's why you wouldn't do any special special music. But Hazinu has God's name, and we also don't do special music. So I don't know what the origin of how far back doing the Shiras HaYam differently comes, but.
Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you to the
Okay.
person who figured out the question.
Okay, Ruth just wants to know about Karnei Para. I think there's a little bit Karnei Para.
We can talk about that next week. A Karnei Para is, if you actually look in the earlier printings, it's not called the Karnei Para. It's called the Pazer Gadol. I'll speak personally, and I'm not going to say right or wrong. When my younger years leining, I used to read it as two klishas. And then when Professor Moshe Bernstein pointed out to me that some call it a Pazer Gadol, it makes sense that a Pazer is one, Pazer, and a Shalshelis is three. So a Pazer Gadol, you do two. I don't know what the music really has to be, but I'll tell you the following. A Karnei Farah is another form of a Pazer. And it's a mafsik just like a Pazer. I don't know if we even know why we get it. And the other special thing about the Karnei Farah is it has a unique servant trop, a unique mishares, namely the Yerach Ben Yomo. You only get a Yerach Ben Yomo right before Karnei Farah. Every Karnei Farah has a Yerach Ben Yomo right before it. I think they're like, and in Tanakh 14, I have the number somewhere.
There's only one in the Chumash,
15.
correct?
Only one. There are only
one
two
in
in
the-
our liturgy, at least Ashkenaz and what we read, and probably anyone else. One in the Torah in Parshas Maseh, in Parak Lamed Hey, and one in Megillas
Megillah.
Esther. And the last-
15 altogether. 15.
Okay, 15.
Okay, the expert Bali Kriya here. It's nice to see. Okay, any other questions? Anybody want to ask a question? I think that's pretty much it from the on the chat box. If any has a question, please ask. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much. Look forward to next week.